The rooftop fell silent. 300 people stood frozen under amber lantern light, champagne glasses suspended mid-sip, every conversation abandoned in the same breath. The woman who had just walked through those doors was not supposed to be here, not at a college reunion, and she was certainly not supposed to be crossing that floor with tears in her eyes, walking past every outstretched hand in the room, heading straight toward a man in a faded blazer whom nobody had spoken to all evening. She stopped in front of him, and in a voice only he was meant to hear, she said two words that changed everything. "It's you." Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me what you think those two words meant. Then buckle in, because the truth behind them is something nobody in that room could have imagined. 20 years after graduation, Nolan Adler almost skipped the reunion entirely. He was not a chief executive. He was not featured in any alumni newsletter. He was simply a quiet, single father who spent his days shaping the acoustic environments of old performance spaces instead of chasing headlines. A man who preferred the silence of an empty concert hall to the noise of a crowded room. He stood in front of his closet for nearly 10 minutes that evening, staring at a navy blazer he had not worn in years, wondering if going back would only remind him of everything he never became. But something pulled him toward that rooftop anyway, some quiet curiosity about the people he once knew. And so he went. The venue was a glass-walled terrace overlooking Lake Michigan, strung with warm lights, its railing lined with people who had spent 20 years building empires. Nolan walked in wearing that old blazer with the fabric slightly worn at the cuffs, and he felt instantly out of place among tailored suits and designer watches. Former classmates greeted each other with loud laughter, comparing companies, comparing houses, comparing lives measured in numbers. A man near the bar boasted about his third vacation property. A woman by the railing described the renovation of her husband's yacht. Nolan simply found a quiet spot near the far end of the terrace and watched the city lights reflected on the water, content to be forgotten. It did not take long before someone noticed him. A former classmate named Trent Kimball approached with a glass of scotch, his tone dripping with the kind of nostalgia that carried a subtle edge of mockery. Trent looked him up and down, taking in the modest blazer, the tired eyes, the absence of any expensive watch or polished shoes. He smiled the way people smile when they believe they already know the ending of someone else's story. "Nolan Adler," he said, still the quiet guy in the corner. Some things never change. Nolan only offered a small, polite smile in return, the kind that revealed nothing. Another classmate joined them, a woman named Margot Healy who ran a public relations firm downtown. Her curiosity sharpened by wine and old habits. She asked bluntly what he was doing these days, expecting to hear a modest answer that would confirm what everyone already assumed. Nolan looked out at the skyline, at the towers rising silver against the darkening sky, and answered simply, "I listen to rooms." Margot laughed, assuming it was a joke, a clever way of dodging embarrassment, and she moved on to find someone more interesting to talk to. Nolan let her walk away without correcting her, the way he had let so many people walk away with their assumptions intact for years. A slideshow had been set up near the small stage, cycling through photographs of the graduating class alongside brief captions listing where each person had ended up. When Nolan's slide appeared, it contained almost nothing, a blank line where a company name or title should have been. He noticed a few classmates exchange amused glances when it flashed across the screen. He did not mind. He clapped along with the rest of the room as slide after slide praised chief executives, hospital directors, senior partners, genuinely glad for people whose paths had simply carried them somewhere different than his own. When Natalie Soren's slide appeared, the applause was different. Louder, sharper, tinged with awe. Her photograph showed her stepping off a private jet, and the caption beneath it read like a headline rather than a biography. Someone near the bar murmured that it was a shame she never came to these things. Someone else said they heard she was in Tokyo this week. Nolan glanced at her photograph for a moment, then looked away. He remembered her only vaguely from those years. A quiet girl who studied harder than anyone he knew. He had not thought about her in a very long time. Someone eventually asked Nolan, half joking, whether he regretted turning down the corner office life so many of his classmates now enjoyed. Nolan considered the question honestly rather than brushing it aside. He said that regret was a strange thing to feel about a life spent doing work he loved, raising a son he was proud of, and sleeping soundly most nights knowing exactly who he was. The classmate seemed unsatisfied with an answer that offered no envy, no hidden bitterness to confirm what everyone wanted to believe about a man who had not chased the same version of success they had. Nolan only shrugged and reached again for his coat, his patience for performing disappointment finally running thin. What none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined standing on that rooftop sipping champagne, was that Nolan Adler had turned down more than a dozen offers from major cultural institutions over the years. He had walked away from orchestras and arts foundations and city planning commissions that wanted him to lead their most ambitious projects, walked away from contracts that would have silenced every whispered judgment on that terrace forever. He never wanted the title. He wanted the work. The quiet satisfaction of walking into a hall whose acoustics he had rebuilt and hearing every note land exactly where it was supposed to. Over the past 15 years, he had shaped the acoustic environments of some of the most celebrated performance spaces in the country. He had redesigned the interior of a crumbling 19th-century opera house in Philadelphia that had been scheduled for demolition, transforming it into one of the most sought-after performance venues on the East Coast. He had restored the sound of a coastal chapel in Maine that preservation experts had written off entirely. Audiences traveled great distances for the experience of hearing music inside spaces Nolan had touched, and not one of them knew his name. Every contract he signed carried the name of his small firm rather than his own. A deliberate choice he had made early in his career after watching colleagues chase recognition at the expense of the work itself. He had been offered prestigious industry awards multiple times and quietly declined nearly all of them, explaining in polite letters that the spaces themselves deserved the recognition, not the person who simply helped them breathe again. His former classmates, measuring success only in visible wealth and public titles, had no way of knowing that the quiet man they had dismissed all evening had shaped rooms they had sat inside without ever realizing it. Nolan drifted toward the exit, half listening to old stories being retold with new exaggerations, half thinking about his son who now lived across the country building his own life. He thought about the years after his divorce, the quiet apartment, the slow rebuilding of himself piece by piece, patient and unhurried, the same way he rebuilt the acoustics of damaged halls. He thought that perhaps this reunion had been a mistake, that he did not belong among people measuring worth in square footage and stock options. He set down his glass, ready to slip out before the formal program began. But this story was only getting started, and what happened next is something no one on that rooftop saw coming. When the glass doors at the far end of the terrace suddenly opened, a hush spread through the crowd like a wave finding the lowest point. Every head turned. Below on the street, a line of black vehicles had pulled up along the curb, their headlights cutting through the early autumn mist. Security personnel stepped out first with the practiced calm of people who did this every day. Cameras that had been quietly documenting the reunion for a local news segment swung toward the entrance. Someone near the bar whispered a name that rippled through the crowd within seconds, spreading faster than any conversation had all evening. Natalie Soren had arrived. The professors who had spent the earlier part of the evening mingling politely with alumni now hurried toward the doors, adjusting their jackets, clearly startled that the youngest self-made female billionaire in the country, a woman whose face had appeared on the cover of nearly every business publication in the world, had chosen to attend a simple university reunion. Her company, Soren Global, had reshaped the music and entertainment industry on 3 continents. Her name alone could move stock prices. And yet here she was, stepping through the doorway of a rooftop terrace in Chicago as though she had never left this city at all. She wore an elegant midnight blue gown that seemed to absorb the light around her rather than reflect it, simple and commanding at once, without a single unnecessary detail. Her dark hair was swept back, her expression composed in the practiced calm the media had grown used to seeing in interviews and press conferences. Photographers who had not been invited but somehow appeared anyway began snapping pictures from the doorway. Alumni who had spent the last hour boasting about their own achievements suddenly found themselves standing awkwardly still, unsure whether to approach or wait to be acknowledged. Whispers moved through the crowd in overlapping waves, each person trying to piece together why someone of her stature would bother appearing at an ordinary reunion rather than sending a generous donation in her place. A few alumni speculated she was scouting the university for a partnership, perhaps preparing to announce a scholarship fund or a new academic building. Others assumed she had simply come out of nostalgia, a rare private indulgence from a woman known publicly for never allowing sentiment to slow her down. Trent Kimball straightened his jacket and smoothed his hair, already rehearsing an opening line, certain that a woman like Natalie Soren would naturally gravitate towards someone with his standing in the business world. Nolan, still standing near the far railing with his coat draped over one arm, watched the commotion from a distance. He had been seconds away from leaving. Now he paused, held in place by the same quiet curiosity that had brought him to this terrace in the first place. He recognized the name immediately, the way anyone would recognize a name that appeared on magazine covers and cable news tickers and the sides of concert halls across the country. But the face he remembered from college did not match the empire attached to it now. He remembered a girl who borrowed lecture notes and ate lunch alone near the music building. He could not quite reconcile that memory with the woman the entire rooftop had fallen silent for. Instead of stopping at the welcoming committee, Natalie moved past the university president mid-sentence, past every outstretched hand and hopeful smile angled toward her, as though none of it registered at all. Her focus carried the same intensity investors described when she walked into negotiation rooms, known to unsettle even seasoned executives twice her age. Except tonight, there was something softer beneath it, something that looked almost like fear wrapped inside determination. The crowd instinctively parted to let her through, forming a loose corridor across the terrace floor without anyone quite deciding to do so. Everyone suddenly understanding even before they knew the reason that they were witnesses to something rather than participants in it. The university president stepped forward, extending a hand, and beginning a rehearsed welcome about the honor of having such a distinguished alumna return. Natalie shook his hand politely, offered a brief and gracious smile, and thanked him for the invitation. But her eyes were already moving past him, scanning the crowd with a focus that had nothing to do with professors or photographers or the dozens of former classmates eager for her attention. She was searching for someone specific, and everyone in the room could sense it, though none of them yet understood who. Several people tried to catch her attention. A businessman who had once shared a dormitory floor with her stepped forward, hoping for a photograph. A woman who claimed to have been her closest friend in college waved enthusiastically from across the terrace. Natalie offered polite nods to each of them, brief acknowledgments delivered with practiced grace, but she did not stop walking. Her gaze had already found what it was looking for near the railing on the far side of the terrace, standing quietly apart from the crowd in a blazer that had clearly seen better years. Nolan felt the shift before he understood its cause. He noticed the sudden silence, the way every face had turned in one direction. He turned as well, expecting to see whatever celebrity had commanded such attention, and found instead that the woman everyone was staring at was staring directly back at him. For a moment, he thought he must be mistaken, that her gaze was fixed on someone standing near him, someone more deserving of that intensity. But there was no one near him. There was only the railing, the lake, and Natalie Soren walking straight toward him with the kind of certainty that made the entire rooftop hold its breath. She crossed the terrace floor without hesitation, her heels clicking against stone in the otherwise silent night, past astonished professors and stunned classmates who parted instinctively to let her through. Nobody dared to speak. Nobody dared to interrupt whatever was unfolding, though not a single person present understood what that was. Nolan stood frozen by the railing, his coat still draped over one arm, watching the most powerful woman in the room close the distance between them with an expression he could not quite name. Somewhere between joy and something achingly close to grief. She stopped only inches away from him, close enough that he could see her composed public expression begin to crack at the edges. Close enough to see her eyes already glistening with tears she had clearly been holding back since she walked through the door. The entire rooftop watched in stunned silence. Hundreds of eyes fixed on two people standing near the railing, waiting to understand what connection could possibly exist between a billionaire and a man they had spent the evening quietly dismissing. Natalie studied his face for a long moment, as though confirming something she had already known the instant she saw him from across the terrace. Then in a voice soft enough that only he could hear it clearly, though the silence carried it further than she intended, she spoke two words that would change everything anyone in that room thought they knew about both of them. "It's you." To understand what was happening on that terrace, One had to travel back 20 years to a version of Chicago that existed before glass towers and gleaming corporate headquarters reshaped its skyline. Back then, Natalie Soren was not yet a name printed on magazine covers. She was simply a scholarship student from a struggling family, working 2 jobs between classes just to afford textbooks, terrified every semester that the letter confirming her financial aid would fail to arrive. Her father had run a small recording studio on the South Side for nearly 2 decades, a modest operation that served local musicians and church choirs, barely profitable, but filled with the kind of warmth that made everyone who walked through its doors feel like they belonged to something. When the studio went under, it took everything with it. The house, the savings, the quiet stability that had held her family together through leaner years. Nolan Adler, meanwhile, was one of the top students in the acoustics and architectural design program. Quiet and unassuming even then. Already known among professors for a rare patience and attention to detail that suggested a future far beyond ordinary ambition. They had known each other only casually at first. Brief conversations in shared classes, occasional nods across the library. But everything changed one bitterly cold evening in late November, when Natalie sat alone in the university's music practice room long after everyone else had gone home, staring at a letter from the financial aid office that confirmed her family's collapse had made the income verification required for her scholarship impossible to provide. The scholarship was at risk of being revoked entirely. She sat there in the dim light of that empty room with the letter crumpled slightly in her hand, quietly deciding that she would have to withdraw from the university altogether and return home to help her parents survive whatever came next. Nolan found her there by accident. He had stayed late working on a design project in a nearby studio. He noticed her sitting motionless in the near dark, and something about her stillness told him this was not an ordinary bad day. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply sat down a few seats away, patient and present, the way he always seemed to be, and waited. The practice room was cold enough that their breath hung faintly in the air. The overhead fluorescents had already shut off on their timer, leaving only the amber glow of a hallway light spilling through the door's narrow window. For a long time neither of them spoke. The silence between them held no awkwardness, only the kind of stillness that made it possible for her to finally say out loud what she had been carrying alone for weeks. Eventually she told him everything. The collapsed business, the impossible finances, the quiet shame of having to leave a place she had worked so hard to reach. Nolan listened without interrupting, his hands resting in his lap, his eyes steady on the floor in front of him, the way someone listens when they understand that being heard matters more than being answered. And when she finished, he said very little, only that she should give it a few more days before making any final decisions. Now remember, at this point in the story, nobody in that ballroom knew any of this. Nobody knew what Nolan did next. And when you hear it, everything about him will make sense. What Natalie did not know, what she would not learn for another 20 years, was that Nolan left that practice room and began making calls that same night. He owned one possession of real value at the time, a 1935 Martin D28 acoustic guitar that had belonged to his grandfather. It was the instrument that first taught him to listen to the resonance of wood, the way sound lived inside a shape. It was what led him to acoustic design in the first place. He had spent years caring for it, keeping it humidified, keeping the frets dressed, treating it less like an object and more like a voice he had been trusted to protect. He sold it within the week to a collector willing to pay well above market value. Quietly, without telling a single classmate. He took the money directly to a professor he trusted completely, a soft-spoken man named Harold Townsend who taught music theory and had always shown a particular kindness toward struggling students. He asked Professor Townsend to route the funds to Natalie through an anonymous emergency scholarship channel the university occasionally used for hardship cases. He insisted on one condition above all others. She could never know where the money truly came from. Professor Townsend tried gently to talk him out of the sacrifice, reminding him how much that guitar had meant to him, how many years he had spent protecting it. Nolan only shrugged and said that a guitar was wood and wire, but a person's future was something else entirely, something worth far more than any possession he could ever own. Professor Townsend finally agreed, moved by a conviction he rarely saw in students so young. Natalie received notice of an emergency scholarship the following week, attributed vaguely to a departmental discretionary fund. She wept with relief in the same practice room where she had once considered giving up entirely. She never suspected Nolan. He never gave her any reason to. In the months that followed, they remained friendly acquaintances, occasionally studying in the same library corner, occasionally exchanging brief conversation. But Nolan never once hinted at what he had done. He watched from a quiet distance as she pushed forward with renewed determination, graduating with honors 2 years later. Only weeks before graduation, Natalie nearly stumbled onto the truth entirely by accident. She had stopped into a small vintage instrument shop near campus, a place she had always loved browsing on quiet afternoons, and the shop owner mentioned offhand what a shame it was that a pristine 35 Martin had passed through his hands recently, sold in a rush by a college student who needed fast money. Something tightened in Natalie's chest at the mention of it. A flicker of suspicion she could not quite explain, but she told herself it was simply coincidence, that plenty of students sold instruments for plenty of reasons having nothing to do with her. She never mentioned the conversation to Nolan, and he never learned how close his secret had come to unraveling years before he was ready to let it go. After graduation, their paths diverged entirely. Natalie left for New York first, then London, working brutal hours at an entertainment management firm before striking out on her own with a small artist booking venture that nobody expected to survive its first year. It not only survived, but grew, expanding across cities and continents until Soaring Global became one of the most recognized names in music and live entertainment anywhere in the world. Through every milestone, every headline, every award ceremony, one quiet thought remained buried beneath her success. A persistent gratitude toward whoever had saved her all those years ago. An anonymous kindness she had never been able to properly thank. Professor Harold Townsend carried the secret with a quiet steadiness that never wavered. Not even during the years Natalie's success grew large enough to attract national attention. Not even when she privately inquired through university contacts, long after she had the resources and influence to press the matter, trying to uncover who had been responsible for that emergency scholarship. The university records remained sealed, protected by the same confidentiality Nolan had requested 20 years earlier. Professor Townsend himself, true to his word, never revealed the truth to anyone. Not even as Natalie's letters and calls grew more insistent over the years. Not even when she once flew back to Chicago specifically to ask him in person. The older man simply smiled and said that some gifts were meant to remain quiet. He kept a single photograph in his desk drawer for 20 years. A candid shot taken at graduation showing Nolan and Natalie standing several feet apart in the crowd, unaware of each other's presence in the frame. Each of them walking toward futures neither could have predicted. Everything changed only 8 months before the reunion, when Professor Harold Townsend passed away peacefully after a long illness, leaving behind a modest estate and a single sealed letter addressed specifically to Natalie Soren. The letter arrived through the university's alumni office, forwarded with careful instructions that it be delivered only after the professor's passing. Natalie opened it alone in her office one evening, expecting perhaps a final farewell from a beloved mentor, and instead found the answer she had been searching for across 2 decades of success and unanswered questions. Inside was a short explanation of what had truly happened that November so many years ago, and one name written clearly at the bottom of the page. Nolan Adler. Natalie read the letter 3 times before the weight of it fully settled. She remembered him vaguely from those years. The quiet student who occasionally sat near her in the library, polite and unassuming, never someone she would have suspected of such an enormous sacrifice. She immediately began searching for him, discovering that he had built a respected but deliberately low-profile career shaping the acoustic environments of historic performance spaces across the country, never seeking press attention, never attaching his name publicly to the work that had quietly made him one of the most sought-after acoustic designers in the field. She studied every project he had ever touched, every hall, every theater, every chapel whose sound he had restored from nothing. And what she found was not the work of a man who had failed to achieve ambition. It was the work of a man who had simply defined ambition differently than everyone around him. When she learned that their 20-year class reunion was scheduled for that same autumn, she made a decision within minutes. She would attend, and she would finally find him. Now, standing beside him near the terrace railing with the entire rooftop watching, the weight of 20 years pressed against the silence between them. Nolan's mind seemed to stall entirely. The noise of the terrace fading into a distant hum as he searched the face in front of him for the memory it belonged to. Something in her eyes, in the particular way she tilted her head while waiting for his response, pulled at a thread buried deep beneath 20 years of quiet, ordinary living. His breath caught somewhere in his chest. He set his coat down slowly on a nearby chair, never breaking eye contact, as though moving too quickly might shatter whatever fragile recognition was forming behind his expression. The silence stretched long enough that people nearby began exchanging confused glances, whispering questions to each other that nobody could answer. Had they dated in college? Had they been rivals? Had some old scandal followed them both for 2 decades, waiting for this exact moment to resurface in front of an audience? Margot Healy, who had laughed at Nolan's answer about listening to Rooms less than an hour earlier, now stood frozen with her wine glass halfway to her lips, staring at the scene with undisguised disbelief. Trent Kimball, who had mocked Nolan for standing in corners, found himself unable to look away either. Natalie finally allowed herself a small, trembling smile, the kind that carried 20 years of unspoken gratitude behind it. She reached out and gently touched his forearm, as though needing physical confirmation that he was truly standing there in front of her and not simply a memory she had constructed out of longing. She asked the question that had followed her for 20 years, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the hushed night. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you let me search for so long without ever saying a word?" Nolan allowed himself a small, tired smile, the kind that suggested he had rehearsed this answer many times in his mind over the years without ever expecting to say it aloud. "If you knew it was me," he said quietly, "you would have spent the rest of your life feeling like you owed me something. And I never wanted you to build everything you built on a debt. I wanted you to know that everything you achieved belonged entirely to you, earned through your own effort, not given as a favor you had to repay." Natalie's composed expression broke completely. Tears slid freely down her face as 2 decades of unanswered gratitude found somewhere to land at last. She had built an empire, negotiated with world leaders, closed deals worth more money than most companies generated in a decade. And yet nothing had prepared her for the simple devastation of hearing that explanation spoken so plainly. The rooftop, still watching in near total silence, seemed to exhale collectively. Hundreds of people suddenly understanding they were witnessing something far more significant than idle reunion gossip. Even Trent Kimball, who had mocked Nolan barely an hour earlier, stood with his jaw slightly open, visibly reconsidering everything he thought he knew about the man in the worn blazer. What almost nobody on that terrace realized, not even most of Nolan's own former classmates who had spent the evening quietly pitying him, was that the modest man standing by the railing was far more accomplished than any title on a business card could suggest. And what Natalie did next proved she already understood that better than anyone. The silence in the room finally broke when Natalie turned slightly to address the crowd, her voice steadying itself back into the composed authority everyone recognized from television interviews and business conferences, though her eyes remained soft and red-rimmed from tears she had not fully wiped away. She announced without hesitation or rehearsed corporate polish that Soarin' Global was preparing to break ground on the largest development project in the company's history. A world-class performing arts center and cultural campus intended to anchor a struggling downtown district back to life. A complex that would house concert halls, rehearsal spaces, community stages, and public gathering areas designed to serve not just visiting audiences but the families who had lived in that neighborhood for generations. She paused, letting the announcement settle over the stunned crowd, then turned back toward Nolan with an expression that left no doubt about what she intended to say next. She wanted him as the principal acoustic and spatial designer, not as a consultant, not as one name among many on a large team, as the sole creative authority responsible for how every performance space within the complex would sound, how every room would feel, how every corridor and lobby would carry the acoustic signature of a place built to last. Given complete authority over a development that would ultimately be valued in the billions and would reshape an entire section of the city for generations to come. The offer landed on the terrace like a physical shockwave. Hundreds of successful executives and professionals suddenly understanding that the man they had spent the evening quietly overlooking was being handed one of the most significant cultural commissions in the country live, in front of all of them. Nolan's expression shifted from surprise into something more complicated, a mixture of gratitude and quiet resistance. He shook his head slowly, telling her gently that she did not need to do this, that whatever debt she believed she owed him had already been paid many times over simply by the life she had built for herself. He explained that he had never wanted recognition for what he did all those years ago, and he certainly did not want a project of that magnitude handed to him out of some misplaced sense of obligation. Natalie only smiled, a knowing, gentle smile that suggested she had anticipated exactly this response and had already prepared for it. She reached into a small clutch bag and withdrew a folded document, handing it to him without another word. Nolan opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the page, and his expression shifted into visible confusion as he read the project designation near the top. Beneath the formal heading of Soarin' Global's flagship development, in a section labeled Principal Design Authority, his own name was already listed. Nolan Adler, Chief Acoustic Designer. The document was dated 3 months earlier, long before tonight's reunion had even been planned. He looked up at her, stunned into silence, waiting for an explanation. Natalie's voice softened even further. She told him that this was never meant to be a repayment for what he sacrificed 20 years ago. She had learned his name from Professor Townsend's letter months earlier and had spent that time quietly researching his work, studying every space he had ever shaped, examining every quiet, uncredited masterpiece scattered across the country. She told him plainly that she had not offered him the position out of gratitude or guilt. She had offered it because no other designer in the country understood how to make a room hold sound and memory the way he did. And the project needed exactly that kind of vision. She was not repaying a debt, she told him gently, her voice carrying clearly across the silent terrace. She was simply returning him to a place that had always belonged to him. A recognition that should have arrived years earlier had he not spent his entire career deliberately avoiding it. For the first time that evening, and perhaps for the first time in longer than anyone on that terrace had witnessed, Nolan Adler found himself completely without words, standing silently while 2 decades of quiet sacrifice and quieter accomplishment finally collided in front of everyone who had once underestimated him. The months that followed unfolded with a quiet intensity neither of them had fully anticipated. Nolan threw himself into the design with the same patient devotion he had brought to every project of his career, walking the proposed site at dawn and dusk, studying how sound moved across empty lots, how wind carried through the gaps between buildings. He spoke with longtime residents about what the neighborhood had once meant to them before decades of neglect hollowed it out. Natalie flew back to Chicago regularly, reviewing his designs in meetings that grew longer and less formal with each visit. Through every obstacle the project faced, permitting delays, structural challenges buried beneath decades of urban decay, zoning disputes that threatened to stall progress entirely, Nolan remained steady in a way that seemed to calm everyone around him. The same quiet patience that had once caught Natalie's attention in an empty practice room, now anchoring an entire team. When a group of residents organized a protest outside the site gates, worried the development would push out the very families who had weathered the neighborhood's decline for decades, Natalie's public relations team urged her to send a spokesperson. Instead, she asked Nolan to walk out with her personally. Together, they spent nearly 2 hours in the cold, listening without interruption, answering honestly. Nolan proposed a resident advisory council on the spot. By evening, several of the loudest voices had agreed to join. He insisted on preserving the original brick facade of an old neighborhood jazz club that had once anchored the district's identity. Engineers said demolishing it would be far cheaper. He refused, spending extra months reinforcing the structure from the inside, so its exterior could remain exactly as generations remembered it. A promise, he said, that the past would not be erased simply because it was inconvenient. Natalie backed the decision without hesitation, quietly redirecting funds to absorb the cost. 1 year after that reunion night, the center opened. Critics called it the finest acoustic and cultural space completed in the country that decade. Longtime residents wept at the ceremony, describing how the design had restored not just buildings, but a sense of belonging they thought had disappeared forever. At a National Design Awards ceremony later that year, Nolan's name was called for the highest honor in the profession, one he had quietly declined multiple times before. This time he glanced into the audience and found Natalie in the front row, watching him with the same soft, tearful pride she had shown on that rooftop 1 year earlier. He accepted without hesitation. Standing ovation. After the ceremony, they walked together through quiet autumn streets near the venue. The same crisp chill as the night of the reunion exactly 1 year before. Natalie slipped her hand into the crook of his arm beneath trees, just beginning to turn gold. She asked him quietly what might have happened if she had never received that scholarship. If her family's collapse had forced her out entirely. Nolan considered the question, then answered with steady certainty. He told her that even if that had happened, he believed he still would have found her eventually. Some people, he said, simply belong in each other's story, no matter how many years or how many roads separate them. Natalie tightened her hand around his arm. No longer the composed billionaire the world recognized. Simply a woman who had finally found her way back to the person who once changed everything without ever asking for anything in return. They passed the old practice room building where their story had begun, its windows dark except for a single light on an upper floor. Natalie slowed without meaning to. She looked up at the building where she had once sat alone with a crumpled letter and no plan for what came next. She felt Nolan's hand tighten gently around hers, steady the way it had always been, even when she never knew it was there. Neither of them said anything more. There was nothing left that needed saying. Only the quiet understanding that some rooms hold more than walls and silence, and some people simply know how to carry both without ever asking for credit. They walked on, past the golden trees and the fading city lights, unhurried, exactly the way Nolan had always shaped things that were meant to last.